I accept the court's decision, and I'm hoping this trial and my convictions have provided some measure of relief for the families. I am not looking for sympathy today. This time is for the family and the friends of the victims. I cannot imagine what pain they have endured for all these years. I know this has been a long and painful process for everyone. I wish I could provide answers to the questions you have. I know I am different. I didn't understand completely why. I thought I had to do with what my mother did to me. I want to do whatever I can to help my daughter. I was not a perfect father, but I tried my best. I am sorry for the damage this experience has caused her. I miss her.
In the heart of Phoenix, Arizona, there lies a seemingly ordinary bike trail. Nestled near a tranquil canal, it was a path well trodden by locals. Many used this trail as part of their daily routine, pedaling along the canal, their minds free of worry. They never thought to look over their shoulders, never paid much attention to their surroundings. It was just a bike trail after all. But as the years passed, this bike trail would take on a sinister reputation. It would no longer be remembered for its serene canal or the peaceful rides it offered. Instead, it would forever be etched in the minds of Phoenix residents as a dark trail of tragedy. 2 innocent lives were abruptly and brutally taken on this trail. 2 murders that shook the community to its core. The victims, MELANIE BERNAS and Angela BROSSO, were regulars on the trail, their lives cruelly cut short by an unknown assailant. MELANIE and Angela were not just victims. They were daughters, friends, and cherished members of their community. Their loss was deeply felt, and their memory continues to haunt the bike trail. As we delve into their stories, we remember them not for their untimely deaths, but for the lives they lived. Lives that were unjustly taken on a bike trail that was once just a part of their routine. This is the true crime tale of the Phoenix Bike Trail murders.
Throughout history, there have been people who have committed some of the most heinous crimes fathomable. For those crimes, they have been convicted and sentenced to death. Welcome to Death Row Executions, where we take a look into the lives of society's worst offenders. And now, your host, Air.
It all started on November 8th, 1992. Angela BROSSO had just recently moved to Phoenix from Pennsylvania and was working as a tech worker. She lived with her boyfriend and was making Phoenix her home. She loved the beautiful weather, and one of her favorite pastimes that became a regular thing for her was her evening bike ride every night around sunset. Angela was 21 years old, but when she set out for the night on her purple mountain bike, her boyfriend Joe decided to stay behind. The reason for this was because Angela's birthday was the following day on November 9th. Angela was just hours shy from becoming a 22-year-old. Joe wanted to stay behind to bake Angela a birthday cake as a thoughtful surprise. Joe finished the special birthday cake and waited for his girlfriend to come home. Minutes turned to hours. A few hours had passed. Still, no Angela. Now, getting worried, Joe took his bike out for a ride looking for Angela. He couldn't find her, so he thought maybe she would be back at the house. He made his way back home, and Angela wasn't there. He decided to take his bike out again to search for her. His mind was frantic, and he had no clue what to do. He ended up riding back home thinking again Angela would be home. He would do this a total of 3 times before phoning Angela's friends and family. No one had heard from Angela, so Joe decided to call the police. A search team went looking for Angela, but they did not find her until the next day, her birthday. Unfortunately, they did not find all of Angela. Her torso was spotted with multiple stab wounds in a field that was right next to the trail she was riding her bike on, but they were unable to find the rest of her body. It was a horrific scene, and Angela's boyfriend, friends, and family were horrified about the devastating news. About 10 days after Angela's torso was found, the community, although disturbed, began using the trail and the canal again. A man went fishing in the canal this particular day, and he noticed a head stuck on the grate. He called the police, and they were able to find out that the head found belonged to the same person whose torso was found a week and a half prior, Angela BROSSO. This is uncomfortable to hear, but many witnesses who viewed the head said her head was in quote-unquote amazingly good condition. The reason for them saying this, though, was because they believed as if her head was kept in good condition because it was maybe a memento for the killer for some time. The rest of Angela's body was never found, and her purple mountain bike stayed missing as well. Weeks went by, months went by, and almost a year after Angela died on this trail, in September of 1993, another murder would take place. 17-year-old Melanie BERNAS had just started her junior year at Arcadia High School. She signed up for accelerated classes and was so outgoing that she played basketball. She was serious about her education and enrolled in a course at the Scottsdale Community College. She lived with her mother Marlene and her older sister and was considered a good young girl, blossoming into a wonderful young lady. September 21st, 1993 was a Tuesday, and it was a school night. When Marlene got home from work, she saw Melanie in the house, and Melanie communicated that she stayed home from school because she didn't feel too well. Melanie was wearing a white t-shirt and pajama bottoms, comfortably relaxing in the house. Marlene started to get ready for a dinner date, and Melanie asked her how long she would be out. Marlene told Melanie it would only be a couple of hours. Marlene believed Melanie, still not feeling well, was going to stay put in the home. She said goodbye to Melanie, kissed her, and told her she loved her. Marlene last saw Stephanie sitting on the living room sofa, and as she was walking out of the door, she said, "I'll see you in a little while." It was around 9 o'clock at night when Marlene returned home, but to her surprise, Melanie was nowhere to be found. Marlene panicked because she expected Melanie to be home. Although panicked, she knew Melanie was a good kid. She was allowed to go out, but had a curfew of 9 o'clock that she always followed. Maybe she was just late. Marlene looked in the utility room and noticed Melanie's bike was missing. Marlene thought maybe Melanie just went out for a bike ride. 10:30 rolled around and still Melanie had not made it home. Marlene really started to panic, and she began calling anyone who knew Melanie. Her father hadn't heard from her, and her friends hadn't heard from her either. Friends thought everything was okay though. They believed Melanie most likely just forgot to communicate with her mom, but she was for sure okay. Unfortunately, Melanie was not okay. The next morning, on September 22nd, a resident in the community by the name of Charlotte Pottle was riding her bike with her sister. Each sister, attached to their bikes, were their young children sitting in bicycle seats. The sisters came out of one of many tunnels that ran under the interstate, and they emerged on the same trail Angela was tragically killed on the year before. Charlotte was pedaling and noticed a random puddle. Typically, young children would jump in a puddle and adults might just ignore the puddle or ride right through it. That is exactly what Charlotte did. She initially rode through the puddle. There was a small splash, but she ignored it. Charlotte didn't feel right though. The puddle was a suspicious puddle. She kept pedaling along the trail, meter after meter. Finally, Charlotte could not help but double back to the puddle she rode through. She felt something wasn't right. She did not want to believe that she saw drag marks or that the puddle looked unusually red. As she got closer to the puddle, she and her sister examined it. They were for certain that it was blood in the puddle. They also noticed that there were drag marks, and the drag marks started at the puddle, rounded around a tree, and then ended at the edge of the canal. They tried to see if there was a body or anything unusual in the water, but they couldn't find anything. Detective Mike Maeslish, who worked out of Phoenix, worked on the first canal murder, and he was one of the first ones to arrive on the scene. It was around 11:30 in the morning, and they knew the scene was abnormal and things were all too familiar. He requested a dive team come and search the canal. Finally, a body was retrieved. It was Melanie BERNAS. They found her wearing a teal bodysuit with sneakers. When Marlene came to identify her daughter, she noticed that the clothes she had on weren't her daughter's. Did the killer change her clothes? Even Melanie's friends, who got word that she was killed and found out what she was found in, they told each other that Melanie did not own those clothes she had on, or they had never seen her wear the bodysuit before. Melanie had suffered multiple stab wounds just like Angela, and there was a cross carved between her chest. Above the carved cross were the letters or initials WSC. Detective Maeslish was quoted saying, "Me and a lot of other detectives spent a lot of time trying to figure the letters out, but we never could." What was the significance of these letters? Upon further searching of the area Melanie was found, authorities found more clothes. There was a green t-shirt, blue shorts, boxer shorts, and underwear. These items were found in a trash bin behind a credit union that was close by. Closer to the body and near the canal, they found a sleeve that was cut from a shirt and a piece of a headphone. On the actual trail, they found a white sports bra that was cut up and stained with blood. Maybe these were the initial clothes Melanie had on when she was biking. Although detectives had a hard time finding the culprit, they noticed that the MO was the same. Both women were attacked from behind and had wounds in their backs. After an autopsy was conducted, it was determined that Melanie had been sexually assaulted. Angela had been sexually assaulted as well. Detectives were hopeful because DNA was left inside of both women. After testing the DNA, they concluded that the DNA found in Angela and Melanie matched. They were killed by the same person. But still, they had no idea who this person was. Theories swirled around the city. Was the killer a doctor? A surgeon perhaps, given the precision of the stab wounds? The thought that this person might have killed others sent a shiver down the spine of the community. Unfortunately, there became a silence about the two victims. The families and friends of both victims clung to the hope of an arrest. Yet, as the years turned into decades, that hope began to wane. The bustling energy of the investigation rooms gradually gave way to a haunting quiet. The case files, once hot with activity, now lay cold and forgotten in the depths of the police department. Cold cases like these often become cold when all leads have been exhausted and no new evidence surfaces. Detectives may have followed hundreds, even thousands of leads, only to hit a dead end each time. Over time, other cases come in, resources are reallocated, and without any new leads or evidence, the case gradually goes cold. However, a cold case can be reopened if new evidence comes to light, such as advancements in forensic technology, providing new ways to analyze old evidence. Sometimes a fresh pair of eyes on the case can spot something that was missed. It takes a detective with tenacity, intuition, and a deep sense of justice to dig up an old case and breathe new life into the pursuit of truth. The hope is always there, flickering in the darkness, that one day justice will be served. The tale of Angela BROSSO and Melanie BERNAS serves as a stark reminder of this enduring pursuit. Detective Mike Maeslish was now retired, and no one can downplay how hard he worked throughout his career. But the truth was that DNA technology was not as advanced as it was in the early 90s, and he could not find the canal killer. A new detective was in town, though, Detective Clark Schwarzkopf. Detective Clark was a detective with the Phoenix Police Department's cold case squad, and his mission was simple but pointed: find the killer responsible for those vicious murders of two young women from the early 90s. Fast forward to the year 2014, over 20 years later, a group of Phoenix, Arizona police detectives traveled to a DNA conference. What would they learn? Could there be something out there that could help them? Yes. There was a forensic genealogist from California at the conference who was also the founder of Identifiers International. Her name was Colleen Fitzpatrick. Bold and brave Colleen confidently walked up to the Phoenix detectives, and Detective Clark was one of those detectives. Colleen said to them, "Hey, I can take Y chromosomes and create these DNA profiles and try to match with genealogy to help solve criminal cases." Detective Clark's eyes widened. He learned that Colleen's company developed software that could dig through public genealogy databases and search for matches to crime scene DNA. I would like to pause the video and ask you guys a question. Do you think this is what they do with DNA that is submitted to websites like Ancestry.com? Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. And back to the story. This was great news for Detective Clark. He believed this could truly help solve many cold cases, especially the one he was currently working on, the Phoenix Canal murders. Weeks passed, and Detective Clark finally had a Y chromosome DNA profile sent over to Colleen, the DNA found inside of Angela and Melanie when they were sexually assaulted. Colleen and her team immediately went to work. They knew their innovative technology would be helpful, and they wanted so bad to find a match for the Phoenix detectives. A name came up in their system after running the DNA. Not just one name, though. 6 matches to the last name Miller. Colleen believed detectives might have their work cut out for them. This did not deter Detective Clark, though. He began a thorough investigation. Detective Clark started looking into the 6 Millers that popped up. One name on the master list was Bryan Patrick Miller. Initially, his name was ignored, but once Detective Clark learned more about Bryan, he suspected he could be the Miller killer. Let's rewind back in time to talk about what Detective Clark learned about the new suspect. Some accounts say that Bryan was born in 1981, but that is inaccurate. He was born on October 24th, 1972. Bryan was the result of an unplanned pregnancy. His mother, Martha Ellen James, was 18 when she had him. Martha and Bryan's father, Lester, married and moved to Hawaii after Lester had joined the Army. Bryan did not have a close relationship with his father, though, because at the young age of 5, his father was killed in a motorcycle accident. He was killed on December 15, 1977. Lester's death affected Martha tremendously. She took her depression and anger out on Bryan. One neighbor said that Martha was an angry, explosive, two-faced. Bryan and Martha remained in Hawaii after Lester's death for a while. Children in the area were known for playing outside and socializing with one another. They noticed Bryan was shy, though. He had no confidence, and it got worse when his mother was around. Martha tried putting Bryan in baseball, but sources say that he was so terrified of the ball and couldn't even play. In 1983, when Bryan was 10 years old, his mother told him that he was going to enjoy a nice summer vacation with some family. He was to travel to Phoenix, Arizona on a plane by himself and stay with his aunt and grandparents. He was enjoying his summer, but when summer was over, he found out that he would not be returning to Hawaii to live with his mother. For whatever reason, Martha no longer wanted to live in Hawaii, but she did not communicate that with Bryan. Martha eventually relocated to Arizona herself and reunited with Bryan after some time. Some say the physical assaults grew worse in Arizona with Martha and Bryan. Physical, emotional, and sexual assaults were handed out. This was a daily, if not weekly, occurrence. What Martha was doing to Bryan screwed him up mentally. Medical experts say that Bryan developed a disturbed sexuality and paired violence with intimacy because of his mother. There were so many witnesses of Martha's behavior, but everyone turned a blind eye. They ignored Bryan, who was always in his own bubble. Many believed Martha had a split personality because she would either be hot or cold, and the change would be in the blink of an eye. Bryan's struggles carried over into school. He began struggling with speech and language, and in school was considered emotionally disturbed. He was in special ed classes and received extra academic support. He struggled to stay on the right path and had been caught stealing a few times. He had even been caught starting a fire at school. One of Bryan's cousins, by the name of Gail Woods, visited Arizona from Wales a few times when Bryan was younger. She recounted a time when Bryan was a teenager and returned home from school. His mother greeted him, but not with love and joy. She was upset that there were cookies missing and began berating him. She wasn't yelling at him about the cookies being eaten, though. She was accusing him of taking them to school to trade for sex. The accusations continued to be hurled at Bryan, and all he could do was cry out, "No, no, no." He continued denying what his mother was accusing him of doing, but she did not believe him. Bryan became so distressed that he went into a fetal position and then started hitting his head against a wall. Not fazed by the abnormal response, Martha still refused to show Bryan any mercy. She yelled out, "I'm gonna get you institutionalized." Gail said that while her and her mother looked on in silence, Bryan was now crying very hard and said, "Please, please phone. Get them to take me away because I'd rather be anywhere than be here with you." Bryan dreaded living with his mother, but he knew no one would ever help him. Martha did not keep her word and never sent Bryan off to an inpatient mental health facility. Even though Martha did not keep her word, Bryan was serious about his words. He no longer wanted to live under the same roof as his mother. When he was 15, he ran away from home, but was caught shortly after he was reported missing. He was first sent to an inpatient mental health facility, but then he was transferred to an outpatient program for troubled youth called Arizona Youth for Change. Martha could not avoid Bryan, though. She was required to attend weekly family therapy sessions with Bryan. The sessions were never easy, though. The therapist assigned to them was Cynthia Elliott. In one session, Martha was visibly upset and not interested in participating in the therapy session that day. She was angry with Bryan, and Cynthia asked her why. Martha said that she had a Barbie doll collection as a wall display. Cynthia questioned what the importance of the doll collection was and why it was making her so upset. Martha then divulged a load of unsettling information. She said that Bryan cut a vagina into all of her dolls, and it basically ruined her whole collection. She believed Bryan was sick and twisted, but whose fault was that? Who introduced Bryan to these twisted thoughts and actions? The therapy sessions were never about Martha's issues, though. Cynthia believed Bryan was her most disturbed patient at the time, and she had never provided any therapy for an extreme case like his before. Most likely angered that all the sessions were about him and not his mom's dirty laundry being aired, Bryan grew more and more angry. While at the Arizona Youth for Change, he was so upset one day, he threw a radio and even tore a chalkboard off the wall. After causing havoc, he ran to the nearest bus stop. He was busted and the youth home wanted to press charges. Bryan was charged with criminal damage and was sent to a juvenile detention center called Adobe Mountain School. He stayed at that facility until March 1989 when he was 16. When he was released, he was on parole, so he had to try and be on his best behavior. Bryan was unable to stay on his best behavior though. Just 2 months after his release, he would get into trouble again. It was May of 1989, still 16 years old. Bryan crossed paths with 24-year-old Celeste Bentley. Bryan ended up catching a bus and Celeste was picked up a few stops later. Celeste did notice Bryan on the bus, but thought nothing of it. When she made it to her bus stop, only she and Bryan got off. Celeste was minding her own business, but she had an eerie feeling. She continued walking, and the next thing you know, she was stuck in her back. She was in such shock that she didn't realize that she had just been stabbed. Celeste initially thought that Bryan had just smacked or punched her back. She shouted at him, "Why? Why did you do that?" She got no response from Bryan. You know how if you stub your toe or someone hits you, you grab the spot that hurts? Well, that is exactly what Celeste did. After reaching to the spot on her back that hurt, she noticed blood on her hand when she looked at it. Celeste began screaming, but by then, Bryan had ran off and was long gone. Celeste was close to her place of work though, and a coworker heard her screaming for help. They called for help, but it took 30 minutes for paramedics to arrive. Paramedics took a long time, but police were quicker to act. By the time Celeste was in the back of the ambulance, and before it was even able to take off to the hospital, police said they had a suspect for Celeste to ID. The ambulance doors were opened, and police had a young Bryan Miller in their custody. Celeste positively identified Bryan as the person who stabbed her, and he was charged with aggravated assault. Celeste survived her attack, and as for Bryan, he was locked up in juvie again before trial. He pled guilty and was ultimately found guilty and sentenced to serve time in juvie until he officially became an adult and turned 18. While Bryan was away serving his sentence, his mother was back at home being nosy and going through all of his things. She stumbled upon something extremely disturbing. It was a note that Bryan had hidden and tucked away. This is the exact note Bryan wrote, and you can read his 4-step plan that involved committing a crime against a woman. He also wished for the crime to be videotaped. Below his 4 steps, he went into detail about wanting to dismember and sexually assault someone. Some parents hide these secrets they find about their children, but not Bryan's mother. She was so distraught about the note she found, she took it to the Phoenix police. Police couldn't do anything though. When it was time for Bryan's release, he was set to go back to live with his mother, but his mother Martha wasn't having it. She reminded police about the note and said she feared for her life. With that, Bryan was not allowed to live with his mother, and since he was officially an adult, he was sent to a halfway house in Phoenix. When Detective Clark stumbled upon the note, he realized that Melanie and Angela were killed in a very similar way to the younger Bryan's wishes. Maybe Bryan had fulfilled his wish. In the note, Bryan mentioned that he wanted to preserve a female head after removing it from the body, and this went back to the witness statements about how the head was in amazingly perfect condition. Detective Clark believed he had the canal killer. Now, it was a matter of finding Bryan and questioning him. Surprisingly, it was extremely easy for Detective Clark to find Bryan because he was somewhat of a local celebrity. He was popular in Phoenix because he was known as the zombie hunter. In our society, we do have people who believe in all sorts of things. People who make bunkers because they think the end of the world is coming, people who think vampires are real, and people like Bryan who believe there were zombies out there that needed hunting. Many believed it was all for show though. Whatever it is he truly believed deep down inside, he went all out with his costumes. He made videos and would walk around town in a long trench coat with giant goggles and a helmet. He also walked around equipped with a large gun. Bryan, aka the Zombie Hunter, would participate in parades and festivals. When he took part in these parades, he drove his tricked out old police car that had the word Zombie Hunter on it. Bryan went all out. Surprisingly, law enforcement had already knew of him because they had posed with him throughout the years for photo ops. Bryan would willingly pose with anyone who wanted a picture with him. Bryan didn't care too much for the photos with regular fans. He absolutely loved the pictures with law enforcement and had a collection of those he saved. Do you think it's because he had a secret they never knew about? Did he think he was smarter than the law? Well, not for long. Some law enforcement believed Bryan was a harmless pillow and soft like a marshmallow. These are their exact words, by the way, not mine. Despite his status in Phoenix, Detective Clark still wanted to speak with Bryan. Before bringing him in for questioning, though, Bryan was being surveilled. Thankfully, Bryan wasn't a zombie hunter full-time and had a full-time job working at an Amazon warehouse. He would drive his zombie hunter mobile to work, take a 15-minute break, and, like clockwork, would blast his music really loud during his 15-minute break and his lunch break. Bryan wasn't seen doing too much of anything else. All Detective Clark needed now was his DNA before questioning him, but the question was how he would get it. He decided to go undercover and concoct a story to get Bryan close. He wanted to be unassuming. He walked up to Bryan's car while he was on his break and introduced himself as a security consultant. He told Bryan that there was a warehouse close by and that some hooligans kept robbing the place. Now it was time to reel Bryan in. Would you be interested in working for me as a security officer watching the building while you're outside? I'll pay you $20 an hour. Back then, that was some good, easy, fast money, and Bryan's eyes lit up. It wasn't going to be as easy as Bryan thought, though. Detective Clark told him that he still needed to fill out a job application. I guess Bryan didn't think it was weird that a warehouse building owner would have future employees complete applications at a random Chili's restaurant, but his alert bells did not go off. Bryan met with Detective Clark on January 2nd, 2015 at a Chili's restaurant to fill out an application. On standby was a team from the Phoenix Cold Case Unit. They were there to collect anything Bryan used that could possibly have his DNA on it. The restaurant knew about the undercover sting and sat Bryan and Detective Clark away from other patrons who were dining. To Detective Clark's surprise, though, Bryan brought his 15-year-old daughter, Sarah. Detective Clark found out that Bryan was a single dad raising his daughter, Sarah, after a divorce. Detective Clark, Bryan, and Sarah sat down, and Detective Clark told them to order food. Bryan ordered a hamburger, and to drink he had water. Detective Clark truly wanted DNA from a fork, a spoon, any utensil for that matter, or even a cup. Bryan scarfed his burger down without using any utensils, and he never took one sip of his water. Detective Clark thought his undercover sting would be a bust, and they would leave the restaurant without Bryan's DNA. He asked Bryan, "Are you sure you don't want something else to drink? You just got water." Bryan replied, "No, I'm good. It was looking like the cold case squad would have to try something else. Just as they lost hope, Bryan took a sip of his water. Detective Clark was ecstatic on the inside, but stoic on the outside. The sting was not a bust after all. Even though Detective Clark was happy about the evidence they went there for, something didn't feel right. He felt that Bryan was a good guy and he felt bad. He took his daughter almost everywhere with him. He was a single dad. He was a local celebrity. He was kind, gentle, and soft-spoken. Detective Clark said all of these things to himself and to his colleagues. He did not believe Bryan Miller was their man. He remembered the things he learned about Bryan's past, but he said, "I just don't see this guy as being the monster in 1992 and 93 that would do this to these women." Detective Clark let his guard down and allowed Bryan to give him a tour of his zombie hunter mobile. Bryan was hopeful that he had a new job, and Detective Clark was for sure that Bryan Miller wasn't their man. Bryan and Sarah left in their zombie hunter mobile, and Detective Clark went out of sight. The cold case team went to the restaurant and collected the water mug that Bryan drank out of. The water mug was sent to the crime lab. Everyone in the cold case unit was waiting for the results. Before I tell you all how long it took for the results, comment below how long you think it took to get the DNA results from the crime lab. Was it 3 days, 8 days, or 11 days? "11 days later, there was a call from the crime lab. The results were finally in. It wasn't just Detective Clark getting the news, though. The whole unit was called in for a meeting. They didn't know, though, that the results were in and why they were called in for that meeting. They were all questioning one another. What is this about? Why are we here? While they were waiting, one detective jokes around and says, they must have solved the canal murders." There were a few chuckles, and after some time, the head of the crime lab unit walked in. Before addressing the whole room, though, she leaned down towards Detective Clark and said, "It's him." "What?" replied Detective Clark. "Bryan Miller, it's him." the head of the crime lab unit said. "You've got to be kidding me," is all Detective Clark could say. They all learned that the DNA left behind on the mug from Chili's was the same DNA from the Angela and Melanie murders. The man who he told everyone was a soft and innocent marshmallow was really an evil killer. Now it was time to apprehend Bryan and bring him in for questioning. It wasn't hard to find him, and he was arrested within hours. Bryan had been free and living life for over 2 decades. He believed that surely everyone would continue to believe that he was an innocent, fun-loving guy. The charade could not be up. A detective was in the interrogation room with Bryan. This was part of their exchange. The detective brought up Angela and Melanie, the 2 ladies killed in the early 90s. "We have DNA that links you to those 2 ladies. I don't see how that's possible. Would help you to get it off your chest if you did something like that. I didn't kill anyone." "You didn't kill anybody?" Bryan continued to play dumb. Maybe he was unfamiliar with the new DNA technology. During the interrogation, investigators were able to get a search warrant to Bryan's home, the single-family home he lived in with his daughter. How many of you have seen the show Hoarders? There have been so many extreme cases on that show, from the lady who would defecate and relieve herself in paper bowls, rinse the bowls out and make soup in it like it was no problem, to the cat lady who kept the animals that passed away, even roadkill, stashed in Ziploc bags in her freezer and fridge, to the woman who had dishes on top of dishes or dirty dishes on top of dirty dishes in her home and had no space to even walk. Well, when investigators stepped foot in Bryan's home for the first time, this is exactly what they experienced, a hoarder's house. They said as soon as they walked in, it looked like he had everything he had ever collected throughout his entire life. This is a picture of just his kitchen. If you look closely, there's a fresh onion on the cutting board, so he would cook for himself and for his daughter and disregard the mess around him. There were only small pathways detectives could walk through because everything else in the house was piled to the ceiling. Detective Clark stepped foot in the home and said, "This is a nightmare." This would take them weeks, if not months, to go through everything in the house. They would need a whole team. Back in the interrogation room, Bryan began telling the detective a little about his life and history, also the people in it. He said he got along with everyone. Actually, there was one person he despised, his ex-wife Amy, Sarah's mother. Bryan was quoted saying, "Amy is the one person on the face of the earth I could probably honestly say I hate." Typically, when someone is named in an interrogation, detectives try their best to interview them as well. They reached out to Amy, and she agreed to come in to answer a few questions willingly. Bryan was not expecting the only person in the world he hated to be in a room that was close to the room he was interrogated in, spilling information about their private conversations. First, we learn a little about the relationship between Amy and Bryan. Amy first met Bryan in 1996 when she was 19, and less than a year after meeting, they moved from Phoenix to Washington State. The couple had been married for 8 long years before they divorced, and in those 8 years, Bryan was comfortable with sharing intimate secrets with Amy. Amy told detectives that in the past, Bryan told her about the murder of a young girl who had come to his door, someone besides Angela and Melanie that Bryan could have possibly killed. Maybe Bryan had killed more than one woman. Maybe he was a serial killer. Amy did tell Detective Clark that although she never told authorities, Bryan once told her that back when they lived in Phoenix, way before he met her though, he killed another female. Amy said she was young and didn't go to authorities because she was scared. She wanted to be a supportive wife and didn't know if Bryan was telling a sick joke or not. Amy said that Bryan told her, "You support your man no matter what." After defending herself and her reasons for not going to authorities, Amy continued on with what Bryan told her. He said a girl came to his door, he grabbed her, pulled her inside, and he killed her immediately. He said that he dismembered her and left her in a trash bin that was on the street. Amy said that Bryan never gave her name, but that was enough for Detective Miller to do some digging. Now remember back to when I told you that Bryan stabbed a woman named Celeste who was on her way back to work? After that incident, Bryan's mom did not want him to live with her, so he lived in a halfway house. Now 6 months before Angela BROSSO was killed, on May 26, 1992, another girl was killed, 13-year-old Brandy Myers. Brandy and her sister Kristen walked to and from school. Bryan's halfway house was a block away from the girls' school, and 3 blocks away from where Bryan lived, that is where they lived. One night, Brandy left home and never returned. This was all speculation though, because Brandy's body was never found. Bryan was still detained for the murders of Angela and Melanie, but he was not charged for the murder of Brandy due to lack of evidence. It did not stop there. There were more women, but one survived. Back in 2002, and this time not while Bryan was in Phoenix, but when he was living in Washington, a woman named Melissa Ruiz Ramirez called the police one night. What happened that night was that Melissa was walking down the street by herself. I'm unsure if Melissa was a woman of the night, but she said a man pulled up beside her in her car and she lowered her guard because she recognized him. It was Bryan. He had an interaction with her friend once before. Bryan drove Melissa to his job so that she could use a phone. She said that while she was on the phone, Bryan came charging towards her like a linebacker with a kitchen knife and stabbed her in the back. Although injured, she fought back. She was able to escape and got a hold of the police. She gave authorities a description of Bryan, his car, and where he worked. When police met up with Bryan, he admitted to injuring Melissa, but he said he did it in self-defense because Melissa randomly walked into his place of work to make a call. Bryan claimed that the phone was just a ruse because it was Melissa who was equipped with the weapon and he had to fight her for possession of it. Police did not believe his story and he was charged with first-degree assault with a deadly weapon. Bryan was locked up in May of 2002, but in December of 2002, his trial began. Opposite of the police and detectives who believed Melissa, the jury did not believe Melissa's story. They believed she was telling nothing but lies, so Bryan was acquitted of his first-degree assault charge. Bryan's ex-wife, or wife at the time, Amy, stuck by Bryan's side the whole time. He would write her letters from jail before being released. The letters started off by claiming he was innocent, and then the letters became dark, expressing his sexual desires and telling her what he was going to do with her when he was out. Amy claimed that when Bryan was released from jail, he changed for the worse. She said his whole vibe was dark, and he began doing evil and twisted sexual things that he had never done with her before. Sometimes, things got so dark that he would use weapons near Amy's vital organs just to please himself or satisfy his desires. Despite continuing to claim his innocence, Bryan was locked up in jail and indicted on 2 murder charges. His trial began in October of 2022. Surprisingly, Bryan's defense team thought it would be in Bryan's best interest to admit that he truly was the man who killed Angela and Melanie. Kind of hard to go against DNA found inside 2 women. Although admitting guilt, they tried to say that Bryan was crazy, so they pleaded insanity. They also requested a bench trial, meaning there would be no jury to decide Bryan's fate. The judge presiding over the case was Judge Suzanne Cohen, and Bryan's defense started by telling the judge about his horrific childhood living with his mother Martha. Martha was unable to provide any witness testimonies because she died in 2010. They proceeded to say that his mother was obsessed with adult films and would have Bryan watch them. Prosecutors brought up the fact that Martha was a detention officer and she was just disciplined and expected to have a disciplined child. Defense said that the job got to her head at times and that Bryan would be assaulted with her job's security law enforcement belt. It was not just normal discipline. In terms of mental health, defense claimed that Bryan felt as if there were multiple TVs playing on in his head, which was causing him to go crazy. The defense brought up an expert witness. Psychologist Bethany Brand testified on behalf of Bryan after meeting with him, and she told Judge Cohen that Bryan developed dissociative amnesia. Despite being able to recall all of the events told in this story, psychologist Bethany Brand said that Bryan had a hard time remembering traumatic events. In response to the defense claims, the prosecution team said it was an absolute lie that Bryan could not remember traumatic events because he had no issues talking about the crime he committed against Celeste when he was 16, a crime that got him locked up. Prosecution also had something up their sleeves, something or actually someone that Bryan hated, or shall we say the only person he hated. Amy took to the stand and told everything she told detectives privately when she was initially interviewed. Amy was questioned about Bryan's scary behavior in bed. This was part of the exchange between attorney Elizabeth Reamer and Amy. Did you ever say anything to him about wanting it to stop because it was scary? No. Why not? I was avoiding any confrontation with him at all at that point and wanted to be as compliant as possible so that I would say, will he love me enough not to kill me? Did he ask permission prior to using needles on you? No. Did he ask permission prior to tying you up? No. What percentage of your sex life after he got out of jail in Washington included bondage, the pins, or other things that were not the normal sex you'd been having early in your marriage? Probably at least 95%. Amy provided vital information to help the prosecution. There were some witnesses that testified on Bryan's behalf that would talk about how his mother treated him growing up. Overall, there were 36 witnesses for Bryan's trial, and the trial took half a year to conclude. At the conclusion of trial, Judge Cohen read the verdict. Bryan was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder against Angela and Melanie. Who knows if Bryan was still trying to play up his insanity plea before the sentencing, but when he heard the verdict, he gave no emotional response whatsoever. No remorse, no nothing. Although Bryan offered no emotion, the victim's family, Linda BROSSO, Angela BROSSO's mother, spoke to the court and shared her feelings and emotions. She was quoted saying, "The defendant broke my heart, took all hope and light from me and my family. The hole in my heart is so big and empty." Melanie BERNAS' sister, Jill, also spoke in court. "For 30 years now, we've had to live without Melanie because the defendant murdered her. Words cannot even begin to describe the level of excruciating pain we experienced with the news of her horrific death." After the victim's family got a chance to speak, it was now time for Bryan to speak. For the first time in this trial, mind you. "I am not looking for sympathy today. This time is for the family and friends of the victims. I cannot imagine what pain they have endured for all these years. I know I am different. I thought it had to do with what my mother did to me. Would it be enough to persuade Judge Cohen?" Bryan's defense attorney stepped in. This was truly a matter of life or death. Would Bryan be sentenced to death or be given life in prison? Defense pleaded with the judge to give Bryan mercy despite not showing his victims any mercy. He believed that justice would be served if Bryan got life. It did not have to be the death sentence. Now it was time for the judge to speak. She did not deny that Bryan had a horrible childhood. There was proof that he had been assaulted as a child on multiple occasions. Bryan was competent, though, and knew what he was doing. She believed it was not an excuse to kill other innocent women. With that, Judge Cohen said, "There is no question that what the defendant did deserves the death penalty." Mr. Miller, anything you wish to say to the court? I guess thanks for listening to everything that was said and giving us at least the opportunity to try and convince you otherwise. Bryan Miller was sentenced to death in June of last year, June 2023. Bryan's first known kill happened 31 years prior, back in 1992. Although it was a long time, all of the detectives who worked on the cases and the victims' family members believed justice was finally served. Thank you all for watching another episode of Death Row Executions. Let me know what you guys think of this story in the comments below. Previously on Death Row Executions, I told the story of John Jacobson Jr., aka Skylar De Leon, someone who was guilty of killing 3 people and was sentenced to death for it. If you missed it, click this video to check it out.